So today we're going to break down the anti-immigration protests that just happened all across Australia. We're going to get into what happened, the very different views on what was driving the whole thing, and what it all really means for the country.
It all kicked off on August 31st, when a movement calling itself the March for Australia hit the streets. But as you'll see, the story is way more complex than the headlines might suggest. There were two completely different narratives about what these protests were truly about. So let's unpack what was really going on.
And we're not just talking about one city. This was huge. Nope, this wasn't just happening in one place. These protests were organized to happen at the exact same time in every single state and territory capital, from Sydney all the way over to Perth. It created this big national moment of tension.
So you can just imagine, the atmosphere on the day was incredibly tense. I mean, we're talking a massive police presence, up to 1,000 officers just in inner Sydney alone. And get this, in Melbourne, the entire central business district was declared a designated area, which gave police extra powers to search people for weapons. The situation got so charged, the police actually had to put up barriers to keep the marchers and the anti-racism counter-protesters apart. It was so concerning that several migrant community groups even told their members to just stay home to be safe.
Okay, so that's the scene on the ground. But the real question, the big one, is why? What was actually motivating the March for Australia?
And this is where things get really interesting, because you basically have two completely different stories. On one hand, you had the organizers and the people marching, and they were talking about things like opposing mass migration and being worried about the strain on housing and jobs. But on the other hand, you had government officials and experts saying, hang on a second, we think these points are being used to hide far-right ideologies and to blame immigrants for much deeper systemic problems. And the government? They did not hold back. The Multicultural Affairs Minister, Anne Ali, didn't mince words at all. She called it far-right activism grounded in racism and ethnocentrism and said it has no place in modern Australia. Yeah, a really strong, direct condemnation.
All right, let's peel back another layer here. Let's dig into the specific language that was used to get people fired up for these rallies, and some of the really controversial connections that started raising red flags for authorities and watchdog groups.
Okay, so this number, 1,500, this was a huge part of the story. This idea that 1,500 migrants were arriving each day spread like wildfire on social media and talkback radio leading up to the protests. And you can see how that would create this powerful sense of crisis, right? An emergency.
But, and this is a huge but, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is the official source for this kind of data, they came out and questioned those numbers directly. They put out a warning saying that figure was not an accurate reflection of actual immigration. So it really highlights how misinformation was potentially being used to stir up anxiety.
So it wasn't just about the data. Critics also started pointing to who was showing up and supporting the movement. And this quote from sociologist Simon Copland, it really sums up that concern perfectly. It's a pretty powerful statement about what it might mean when certain groups attach themselves to your cause.
So what were these red flags that had authorities so concerned? Well, let's break it down. You had a prominent neo-Nazi, Thomas Sewell, calling the protest our rally. Then you have a Sydney organizer who was actually recorded saying they needed violence, similar to the Cronulla riots back in 2005. Online, you had supporters sharing pro-Hitler memes and calling for remigration, which is basically a term used for the mass deportation of non-white people. These are the kinds of documented links that drew so much scrutiny.
And this slide, wow. This really lays out the strategy that some people were apparently using. An organizer was recorded advising this exact path. The idea was to start with something that sounds pretty reasonable to a lot of people: protect Australian heritage. Then you slowly shift the language to protect European heritage. And from there, it's a small step to the core idea you really want to introduce: protect white heritage. It's a recorded example of a pretty calculated attempt to make certain ideas sound more mainstream.
All right, so now that we have all that context, what does it all mean? Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture for Australia.
Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner, Giridharan Sivaraman, put it like this. He's basically saying that all this rhetoric is a dangerous distraction. It stops us from talking about real solutions to real problems, like housing or inequality, and instead it just risks fanning the flames of racism.
And this really gets to the heart of the whole debate, right? It forces us to ask, are immigrants being turned into a scapegoat for much deeper, more complicated problems in our society? You know, things like housing policy, infrastructure, and wages not keeping up. And that leads to another really tough question. In a democracy where we value free speech, How do we draw the line between a legitimate democratic protest and the manipulation of that protest by extremist groups who have a hateful agenda? It's a really tricky balance.
So what did the politicians have to say? Well, if you look at the response, you can see there was concern pretty much across the board. Both the federal government and the Greens came out and strongly condemned the rallies. The opposition went with a slightly different approach, calling for calm and respect. But the main thing is, no major political party actually endorsed the protests, which signals this widespread, cross-partisan unease with what was going on.
All right, let's tie all of this together. After this really complex and divisive day, what are the big takeaways? What should we be reflecting on? You know, this really boils it all down to the core tension. On one side, you've got these genuine, real-world anxieties that people have about the cost of living, about housing, about jobs, totally legitimate concerns. But on the flip side, there's this huge risk that those very real anxieties can be hijacked by extremist groups to push their agenda, to normalize hate, and to really threaten the social cohesion that holds the country together.
So, at the end of the day, what these protests really showed us is a society that's wrestling with some very real economic pressures. But they also act as a pretty stark warning about how dangerous it can be when we start blaming complex problems on simple and often false enemies. It's a recipe for division.
And that leaves us with one last massive question to think about. In this era of economic anxiety, in this era of misinformation spreading so quickly, how does a nation like Australia manage to protect both the right to free expression and at the same time protect the inclusive, multicultural values that are supposed to bind everyone together?